Hi, I'm Liv, I paint buildings, and today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint this Bristol shopfront. I'm going to be showing you how we went from this to this. This illustration is part of my watercolour colouring pages box set. You can grab this and 4 other Bristol shopfronts in the Bristol edition. These illustrations are hand-drawn by me and printed on watercolour paper, so you can grab the box set and paint along with me. This is IOTA. It's a lifestyle store on Gloucester Road in Bristol, and today we're going to be bringing it to life. So if you'd like to know more about my work, or if you want to grab the set of 5 illustrations to paint along with me, you can find out more at Livpaintsbuildings.com. If you'd rather just get stuck in and tackle this painting yourself, the box set does include some reference images you can work from. This is by no means a tutorial that you have to follow, it's just here to give you some guidance. That's enough rambling from me, so let's get started. You could use any kind of painting materials for this. I'm going to be using watercolour, but you could use gouache, acrylic, pastel, pencil, anything you like. I've been collecting lots of my favourite paint colours for a few years now, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge of various different brands. You don't need to use professional grade paint to do this. You could easily use student grade. I love Daniel Smith and Sennelier brand, but Winsor & Newton student grade Cotman paints are a great alternative. I've just got 4 different brushes that I'm going to be using today, ranging in sizes for a variety of different uses. These are my 2 favourite brushes, and I think the most versatile brushes in my collection. These are from IOTA Lab. Unfortunately, these came in a watercolour beginners set and they aren't available to purchase separately, but IOTA do have a 10-piece brush pack. So if you don't have any brushes and you're looking to get a set, I would highly recommend these. The tips were white when I bought these, but I've used these so much that they're now completely stained, but they are still just as good. These are great because they're very rigid and the barrel here comes to a point, so you can get a lot of paint in the paintbrush and still get a very fine tip. So they're very versatile and I'd highly recommend these. For finer details, I have this size 1 round brush from ProArt. It's a Proline Plus 007. I've had this brush for so long that it's kind of shaped into my hand position, if that makes sense. So the bristles here aren't completely round anymore, and I find it really useful for painting bricks, especially smaller bricks, and also just finer details in general because it's such a fine tip brush. The finer brush I've got in my collection for today is the square tip brush. It's a size 4 flat brush from Escoda. It's a synthetic brush. It's fairly new to my collection. I haven't used it very much, but the square tip on it makes it perfect for painting bricks, especially those larger ones that can be a bit fiddly to do. If you're painting a lot of bricks, I'd recommend investing in a flat brush. It just makes the process a whole lot smoother. I have a couple of different paint mixing palettes. I have these ceramic palettes. They're just really easy to reuse. As you can see, I haven't cleaned these, and I very rarely clean them because I paint with so many of the same colours in every painting that I do. And because you can just add water and reactivate paint at any time, it doesn't make sense for me to clean them very often, so apologies if you're offended by my messy palettes, but I think they look quite chic. This was a super cheap one. I think I just bought it on Amazon. I thought the size of the wells was appropriate for the kind of painting that I do. This one's very similar, just slightly larger, and it has these 2 bigger wells in the centre. I often paint my greens in here because I use a lot of different shades of green, and it's really handy to have a large reserve of paint on hand. Again, I haven't cleaned this for forever because I use all of these colours on a regular basis. I believe I picked this up from a local art supply store, but I'm sure you can find very similar ones on the internet too. And the last thing I have on hand today is very simply just some paper towel. This is great for cleaning brushes, but also great if you make a mistake. You can just pat this on the paper super quick, and it'll soak up most of the paint. I just use 1 jug of water, and I like to change out the water quite frequently. Some people also prefer to use 2, 1 for washing their brushes regularly, and then 1 keep clean for emergencies. So if you spill some paint on the paper, you need to reactivate it with a clean brush, you can use an emergency pot. I find if I change my water frequently enough that I don't need to keep 2 on hand. Okay, I'm going to make a start. The reference image that I'm using has this massive tree in the way, so we're having to take a bit of artistic license from the start. There's a lot of black in the painting. Black shopfront, black brick, black and white awning, just a little bit of colour in the window display. I'm going to try and be a bit more flexible with the colours that I use. I'm going to use some blue tinted blacks, some purple tinted blacks, just to add a bit of interest into the painting. That's the beauty about painting. You can do anything you want. You can change the colours up, you can paint outside the lines, it's totally up to you. So the first thing I'm actually going to do with this painting is start by painting in the shadows. I find if you do a lot of detail and then paint over the top, you can often lose that detail. It tends to smudge because the water will reactivate the paint. So I'm going to paint the shadows down first and then go over the top with the details of the building. Because there's a lot of black in this, I'm going to mix up a more purple toned shadow colour. I have a Payne's Grey that I use for the base of almost everything, which is just this kind of blue turned black. And then to that, I'm going to add some of this purple colour here. There's a sort of rule with painting that you don't ever use true black and true white. And I think that does have some truth to it. It's not something that I stick by. I do use true blacks and true whites, but I think because of the kind of monochrome tone of this painting, I am going to avoid using true black as much as I can. I like to keep a piece of watercolour paper handy to swatch all of my colours on. I think it's going to be especially important in this one because the tones are so similar. So this is the first colour that I've mixed up for the shadows. As you can see, it's very blue toned, very purple toned. I'm going to put a tiny bit more purple in. I really don't need a lot. And you can see it's a very subtle difference. A little bit more. Yeah. That looks good to me, so I'm going to go with that for my shadows. This is the hardest bit. Brush to paper for the first time. Don't let it overwhelm you. It's just a piece of paper. So I'm just pulling a simple line, trying to keep equidistant between this part of the roof and the bit that I'm shading, otherwise you'll end up with a wonky shadow. The sun in my image, it's quite hard to see where it's coming from. I do like to exaggerate my shadows and give them a bit more depth. So I'm going to say that the sun is coming more from the right side. So I'm going to extend this shadow out a little bit further, just to give it a bit more depth. This is easier to do the quicker that you do it, because then your colours blend together smoother. But if you've left it a bit too long and your colours aren't blending, just use a bit of water, reactivate the paint. So I'm thinking about all the things that stick out from the page. So the eaves over the roof being the main one. Then also got some small overhangs in the windows here. You'll notice I'm still using my big brush. As I was saying in the intro, this has a very fine tip to it, so it's really good for getting the detail while holding a lot of paint in the barrel. That's why I love this so much. You can switch to a smaller brush if you want more precision, but I'm not worried about precision right now. Top tip is not to forget about the panes of the window. The glass will reflect some of that light back, so it's good to get those shadows in there. I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller brush because I'm struggling with these very fine lines. And at this stage, don't worry about being too perfect. We're going to go over the top with some quite dark tones, so a lot of this will get washed out. So don't worry if it looks too bold, too dark, too messy. I promise it won't look like that when it's finished. So I'm just shading under all of the bits that stick out, so really bringing some depth to this. Any overhangs, any indentations, anything like that. Even the finest ones, I'm still giving those a shadow. The more depth there is between an item and the background, so like here with the eaves, the further apart they are, the bigger you want that shadow to be. That gives you a higher depth. So you can see here I've got a very thick line because these eaves come out quite far. Then in the windows I've got a much thinner line because the difference isn't so great. My biggest gap here is going to be under the awning. So I'm going to switch back to my big brush for this. So I want it to be a nice, smooth, consistent colour. I'm not going to worry about this rippled edge right now. I'm just going to do the underside first and then I'll blend it up. I can tell that's not quite straight, so I'm just going to extend it down on this side. I'm also going to paint the door in shadow, but I don't want it to be quite so strong, so I'm going to use a little bit of water just to lighten the shadow up. I'm going to switch back to my smaller brush now to do the details in the shop front. The inside of the building is darker, so you could shade it here. I'm going to be going in with a blue as a tint for the windows, so I'm going to leave this bit blank for now. So now that I've done most of the sharper shadows, I'm going to go in and darken up some of the corners. So the main one here being where the wall touches the floor. This shadow isn't going to be as dark as the sun shadows, so I'm going to add a bit more water to my mix. And then I'm just going to run my paintbrush along the edge here, give it a very subtle shadow. And I'm just going to do a very slight shadow around these lintels here, because they don't sit perfectly flush with the wall. Honestly, this might not even be noticeable by the time I put the black over the top, but I just enjoy shading, so I'm going to do it. If you're worried about smudging with your hand, I'm left-handed, so I really struggle with this. Just let it dry, come back to it in a few minutes and it won't smudge. I'm just going to add a little bit more depth to this shadow in the top. This is going to be the boldest shadow on the page, so I really want this to pop. And that's it for the shadows. Okay, so I've left the painting to dry. It's been about 20 minutes, so this isn't going to lift super easy now. I'm now going to go in with the main washes of the painting. I'm going to start with the main banner here because I want this to be the darkest shade, and I'm going to work backwards from there. So as before, I'm going to start with a base of Payne's Grey. I always start with a base of the same colour, kind of helps to unify all of the colours I use in the painting. I think Payne's Grey is the perfect colour for this. I'm also going to use a little bit of Chinese orange. It's kind of opposite from the blue on the colour spectrum, so it neutralises it a little bit without having to add lots of black pigment. So I'm going to swatch this, see what I think. So you can see it's very black. I think I used a little bit too much orange here. It's a bit too neutral, so I'm going to go in with a bit more Payne's Grey. So I think this is good. So it's a slightly blue tinted, slightly orange tinted black. Yeah, I'm happy with that. This is a very dark colour, so I'm going to wet my brush thoroughly before I dip into this to kind of lighten it up a little bit. We can always come in with more layers, so don't worry if you think it's too light. So I'm going to first trace around the letters in the Shopfront, trying to make sure that when I come in with a bigger brush that I don't go too much into the lines. You can see I'm leaving quite a thick layer of paint here. I really don't want this to dry out before I get a chance to come in and fill in the rest of it, otherwise I'm going to have quite visible harsh lines. By leaving more paint here on the paper, giving it more time to dry. If you use a smaller brush, you also have a bit more patchiness in your wash. If you wanted a smoother wash, I'd use a bigger brush as you can. You kind of cover more at once. Yeah. So I'm liking how this looks. The middle of the O is a bit dark, so I'm just going to pat my brush dry and then pick up some of that paint, trying to keep it around the same tone as the rest of the blackboard there. So I'm now going to move on to the sides of the building. So the sides of the building are a very similar colour, but they are slightly lighter. So I think I'm going to add a smidge of Payne's Grey, a very tiny amount. And I'm swatching it again here. I can see it's a very, very slight difference. So again, I'm just going to dip my brush in the water first, lighten it up a little bit. And then I'm going to do the side panel, the base panels, and this side panel here. I'm just going to make sure that I'm regularly dipping my brush back into the paint. I don't want to be using a dry brush. I want to be pulling the paint around the paper rather than forcing it into the gaps. If you let your brush or your paper dry out, you'll end up with lines between the fills, which I'm not trying to achieve here. I want as smooth of a fill as I can get. So you can see the very slight difference in colour that I've used. You can also start to see how this purple underlayer is affecting the colour that's coming out. I'm now going to go back in and do the frame around the windows and the frame around the door. I'm left-handed, so it's a bit tricky. I'm trying to avoid this piece that I've just painted. Probably should have left this till last, but oh well. Normally I would shift and turn my paper around, but because I'm filming this, I've had to tape it down. So this is going to be a bit more of a tricky hand position, but you can always stand up, move your body, make it so that you've got the right pull. You don't have to stay sat down with your painting facing the same way all the time. Be as fluid as you need to be more comfortable with the painting process. All of this is black, but you'll notice that I'm painting it in separate chunks, even though those chunks are next to each other. You could go in with a big brush, just paint over this whole thing. I find if I do it section by section and I vary the amount of water in each part, I get slightly different tones, and it kind of helps to keep that realism a bit more rather than it all just being one flat same tone. The reference photo that I have hasn't got an amazing view of the door. I'm just doing my best to guess how it looks. If this were a commissioned piece, I would be asking for a clearer photo that shows the door so I can get it in more detail. Because I'm just doing this for fun, I'm not really concerned 100% with the accuracy, so I'm just going to paint how I think it probably looks. So this looks like it might be a window up here, but I think it's a solid panel, so I'm just going to go and paint it in. Now I'm just going to leave this to dry for about 10 minutes. It's kind of in the way of where my hand needs to be to paint, and I want to be able to rest on it, so I'm just going to leave it here and come back in a bit. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes. This is now dry to the touch, and I'm going to go on to doing the background for the top half here. When I look at the photo, the colour isn't that much different from the shop front, but I think for the sake of this painting and to add a bit more depth, I'm going to make the bricks slightly lighter. So I'm going to take that colour that I mixed up before, I'm just going to add a bit more water in it to lighten it up. I also want it to be a bit more orange toned rather than blue toned. So I'm going to take a very, very small amount of that Chinese orange that I put in the first instance. And I'm just going to compare it to the first paint that I used for the top half. I think it's still slightly too blue. I'm going to use the tiniest amount more of Chinese orange. The tiniest amount has definitely made a difference. And I'm happy with that. I also want a fair amount of paint for this because it's quite a big wash. A great tip is to make sure you have more paint mixed than you think you're going to need. If you run out of paint mid-wash, you'll have to very quickly try and mix up a colour so that you don't let it dry before you can finish painting it, and it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to make a match. So it's always better to have more than you think you're going to need. You can always reactivate the paint when it's dried, so you're not going to have anything go to waste. Okay, so I'm thinking about how I'm going to tackle this wash. I'm going to start by going around the frames of the windows, kind of doing an outline around the whole shape, and then I'll fill it in afterwards. So I'm going to start with the bit that I think is going to be the trickiest to reach, which is this corner here. I'm thinking now as this is going down that it might be too light, but I'm not going to worry about that now. I can always go back over the top with a second wash. So I'm making sure I leave the open ends of this paint with enough water so that it's not going to dry out while I'm working on a different area. As you can see in the bit up there, there's quite a big puddle of paint, which is exactly what I want. I don't want these edges to be drying out here. So I'm kind of alternating between the areas that I'm working in, trying to keep the edges wet. So the bigger brush you use here, the more you'll be able to cover in one go, the less streaky it will be. You can see the other side of this fill has already dried, so I wouldn't be able to go back in and add to that without visible lines. The purple pigment that I've used here is slightly granulating, so you can see as it's drying here, it's starting to settle into the texture of the paper a little bit. If you like that crackly look for granulating pigments. I think they're really cool. So while that dries, I'm now thinking about the next big colour on this piece, which is going to be the blue of the shop front window. I am going to again start off with a base of Payne's Grey. I'm going to do this paint mixing off camera. It might take me a while to find the right shade. I've done quite a bit of testing trying to find the perfect window shade. I've been around in circles a few times, but I finally got this shade which I'm happy with, which is quite blue compared to the black of the building, which is what I was trying to go for. So I'm going to start with a very, very light wash. It's going to go over the whole of the window. So this is where it's really important that you let the surrounding colours dry before doing this. If you paint the shop front and then you come and paint the windows, it's very likely that you'll get bleeding. So colour will start to run. The more that I work into this piece, the more chance that the colours underneath are going to lift. So I'm trying to do this with as few brush strokes as possible. I'm trying to be super light with my touch here, so I'm not disturbing the paint so much underneath. This little bit on the side is going to be a little bit darker. It's going to be a bit more in shade. So I've got slightly less water on my brush for this pass. My brush has got some paint left on it, so to make this colour darker here, I'm just dotting it around, letting a bit more of that paint sit on the paper, and then as it dries, it'll dry into a slightly deeper colour. I'm going to go and do the same thing in the top windows here. There aren't any objects in these windows. I can go straight in with a darker wash. Probably should have used a smaller brush here, but you can see the tip of this brush is coming in really handy. I don't normally paint reflections in the windows. It's just not really my style, but I do like the bit of variation that you get in the windows sometimes from having a bit more paint on the brush, and the way that the paint sort of randomly settles on the paper. It gives it quite a nice effect. I should have done this door in the same way that I did this window, because I've got this open sign here. in the window that I don't want to cover up too much. So I'm just going to paint around that for now, and then I'll go in with a lighter wash over that after it's dried. And I just went over the lines a little bit here, so I've just dried off my brush. I'm just going to pick it up like that. So now that my first wash has dried, looking back at my reference picture, I'm thinking there's not quite enough contrast in this top area here. I do think this wall needs to be quite a bit darker. So I'm going to try and bring it down to around the same shade, perhaps even a little bit darker than this. So my paper is starting to buckle slightly now because I've put quite a lot of paint on here. As the water has dried, these big washes has started to buckle the paper. You can tape your paper down to the table or to a drawing board, which is what I normally would do. I didn't think I would need it here, but I definitely did. So that's why you can see this buckling starting to happen. So I'm just going to let that dry, see if I need to go over again with a third wash just to even things out. It looks like this might be quite patchy, but we'll see. So I'm back. I've let this dry for a couple of hours, changed my water, and ready to pick it back up again. This is the fun bit now because we get to add some colour and we get to start to populate the window a little bit. You can pick any colours you want for this. I'm looking at my reference photo. There's a lot of pinks and yellows and a little bit green, so I'm going to try and stick to that kind of colour palette. I already have this pink in my palette, so I'm just going to start with this as a base, and then I want a kind of warm yellow shade, and then for the green I think the colours that are already in my palette will work well. So I'm just going to reactivate the greens that I already have in this palette. I think they're nice shades. I think it'll work well in this painting. We don't need a lot of them, so I don't really need to mix up any more than I already have. So you can go as detailed as you want with this. I deliberately leave the illustration quite bare, so if you want to put your own details into Shopfront, then you can. I'm just going to very loosely paint in some of these details because I prefer my detail to be in the building rather than in the Shopfront, but like I say, it's totally up to you. So I'm going to do just a subtle gradient, I think, a bit of a blend in this square here, and then I'm going to start to dot some colour in around on the shelves as well. I'm not really paying too much attention to what colour stuff actually is. I'm just kind of dotting the colour around. So now that I've painted in those objects, I'm going to let those dry completely, and then I'm going to mix up a bit of a brown colour and start to paint in some of the shelving around it. In the meantime, I'm going to paint the grey colour of this lead work up here. This is a very silvery grey, so much lighter than some of the colours we've used already. And there are some fine details in this, but I'm going to start by just putting a general wash of grey over the top of all of this lead work. And I just realised as I'm painting that leadwork that I've missed the sides of the shop front in black, so I need to go back in and do those. I'll try and match the colour as best I can, but I'm not too worried about it. I've got a lot of different tones of black in this painting, and I think I don't think it's going to look strange if it doesn't quite match. So I'm just going to paint every other stripe. I'm having to hold my hand in a bit of a strange position because I've got areas of wet paint all around this piece at the moment. So it probably would be wiser to let this dry and then I can do it with much more precision, but I'm not too worried about being precise right now. So there we are, that's the stripes on the awning painted. What I can do now is go in and paint the darker blue around the objects in the shop front to give that depth to the space. So I have the same blue that I used earlier. It's just about making sure I have the right amount of water in, because as this has been sat out for a few hours, it's now going to be a little bit darker. Some of that water is going to have dried up. So I'm just going to swatch it on my paper here and make sure that it's the right kind of tone for what I need right now. It doesn't have to be perfect. I am going to come back in here and do some dark colours for the furniture itself. So that'll take up some space too. So it was starting to get a little bit dry. It was getting a little bit patchy. So just before it completely dries down, going over the top with some water to try and salvage it a little bit. It should hopefully get rid of some of those lines. So just like with the blacks, there are a few different shades of white in this painting too. I think the brightest of whites is the shop name here. So I'm not going to touch that. I'm actually just going to leave that the white of the paper. But to make that brighter in comparison to all of the other whites, I am going to dull down the rest of the whites. I'm going to use a very light yellow wash. The yellow I think should contrast the blue in the black quite nicely, and also the actual shop front is a little bit yellow. I find it quite tricky sometimes to paint with such light washes because there's so much water and so little pigment. In my opinion, the worst thing you can do in watercolour is to use a white watercolour paint. If you want the colour to be lighter, you should be adding water, not white paint. If you use white, the pigment tends to be very opaque, and you can see that when you paint, especially when you're painting over an outline like I am here, you lose some of the vibrancy in the line work. So rather than using a white watercolour paint, just adding a bit more water to my paints to wash them down a little bit. I think it's also very important when the white parts of your image are next to the background. You don't want the whites of the background and of the image to be the same. So even just this tiniest bit of yellow, I think really does make a big difference. See just how subtle that is. But I really do think it's helped. I'm just going to dot a little bit from here. I'm cautious of dragging my brush because I know how pigmented this black is and I don't want the black to be pulled across the whole front. So I'm just going to dot very gently. It doesn't have to be everywhere. Just a couple of dots to give it some textures. You can see the black is starting to lift, so I'm going to stop there. Now that the grey on the lead work has dried down, I can go in and add a bit more of that detail. I'm not going to be too careful about it. I just want to make sure these shapes are highlighted. In the picture I can see this is quite patchy, so I'm not going to be too careful with it. I'm now going to focus back on the window display, start to paint in some of the timber colour for the shelving units. I've got a kind of browny tone and I've mixed in some more of that Payne's grey to make it more on the blue side, and again tie all those colours together. If I went in here with a very warm brown, it would be very jarring, so just pulling it down to the kind of same tonal range by adding a bit of that same paint into every paint colour that I'm using. Being very loose with this, my intention is not to make this super detailed. I just want to give a hint of what's in the shop window and a hint of the colours inside. So now that all of the different elements have been painted, I'm going to take a look back at the overall painting, see if there's anything that's missing, anything that doesn't look quite right. To me, it still looks a little bit flat. The shadows that I painted, very first thing, I feel they weren't bold enough. Now that we've got all that black over the top, it's really dulled them down, and I think they need to be a bit more vibrant. So I'm going to go back in with very dark purple and enhance some of those shadows that I painted earlier. I really don't think you can be too dark with shadows. You could paint with a true black if you wanted to, and I think it would look really cool. It's just a matter of how stylized you want it to be. So I'm just going back over what I painted earlier, starting with the shadow of the roof. I'm actually going to avoid the shadow that falls on the white part. I think that's dark enough. I think I just want to deepen up the areas of shadow over the black bricks. I'm going to go into the sign here as well. So there's lots of opportunity to go in and add in more details. You could paint individual bricks. You could do more detail in the shop front. You could get really specific on this detail in the lead working here. I think this is enough for me. I'm going to leave it here. I quite like the very simple washed look of this painting. And so this is my finished piece. Thank you so much for sticking around if you've made it to the end of this video. If you watch this video and you want to have a go at painting this yourself, you can get my watercolour colouring pages box set from my website, which is Livpaintsbuildings.com. Comes in a set of 5 paintings. This is just one of the 5 shop fronts that you'll be able to have a go at. So thanks so much, and see you again next time.